1979. Millions of Iranians flooded the streets to celebrate a victory. They thought they were winning freedom. Instead, they were witnessing the birth of a nightmare. The era of choice ended before the fireworks faded. The contrast was brutal. Just years earlier, Iranian women held rights that didn't exist in most of Europe. They gained the vote before women in Switzerland. They sat in parliament. They practiced law and medicine. The family protection law was their shield. It restricted polygamy. It gave women the right to divorce. It raised the legal marriage age for girls to 18. But the revolution had a different plan. Hope died almost instantly. Ayatollah Khomeini moved fast. He dismantled the legal protections piece by piece. The streets transformed from spaces of protest into zones of total surveillance. Spectacle replaced justice. New Islamic laws turned every public square into a potential courtroom. Women who once led government departments now faced the threat of public humiliation. Rebellion wasn't just discouraged, it carried a terrifying price. The new regime struck the family protection law first. The legal marriage age for girls plummeted from 18 to 9. The echoes of celebratory fireworks in Tehran had barely faded. 1 month later, the screams in Rudsar took their place. March 19, 1979. The newspaper Kayhan reported the scene from the northern city near the Caspian Sea. A mother of 3 had run away with another man. In the old world, this was a family tragedy. In the new one, it was a state crime. Revolutionary officers tracked them down. A judge labeled it an illegitimate relationship. Why was a mother of 3 whipped in the street? For a private life that was legal just weeks before. The sentence? 50 lashes for the woman, 100 for the man. 100 strikes is a lethal dose of pain for an untrained body. The executioner raised the whip. A sharp whistle through the air, a dull thud against skin. The crowd in Rudsar gathered in a tight circle to watch. They saw the leather bite into the woman's back. They heard the rhythm of the strikes. No one intervened. This was not an isolated incident. On March 8th, while Tehran marched for freedom, Esfahan watched a different spectacle. 3 people stood before Ayatollah Khomeini, 2 men, 1 woman. The charge was corruption. The judge's order was absolute, 100 lashes each. The street became a courtroom and a torture chamber simultaneously. The leather left red tracks on their skin in full public view. Once the beating stopped, the humiliation continued. The victims did not simply leave. They were forced to repent on the spot before being released. The whip in the square was just the beginning. The legal foundation for these public floggings was a document signed by Khomeini on March 7, 1979. It was a bureaucratic ambush. Khomeini issued a decree targeting every woman in the civil service. He did not call for a debate. He did not offer a transition period. He simply declared that uncovered hair was nakedness. In his eyes, a woman without a scarf was a moral threat to the state. The mechanics of the purge were simple. Guards stood at the entrances of every government building. They watched the doors. Any woman arriving without a hijab was blocked. No entry, no work, no paycheck. For millions, the shock was total. During the revolution, Khomeini had remained silent on dress codes. Many believed faith would stay a private matter. They were wrong. On March 8th, the morning after the decree, the women of Tehran realized their personal freedom had been traded for a religious mandate. The morning of March 8, 1979, changed everything. Tehran woke up to a different city. Thousands of women walked out of their homes. They left their headscarves behind. It was International Women's Day. Look at the crowd. University students in jeans stand next to mothers in coats. Secular professionals link arms with religious women who had fought for the revolution only weeks before. A sea of black hair and clenched fists filled the streets of Tehran and Qom. They didn't just march, they reclaimed their bodies. The state reacted instantly. Pro-Khomeini militiamen moved in. Revolutionary guards formed a wall of olive drab. They didn't use logic, they used intimidation. The air turned heavy with the smell of gunpowder. Guards raised their rifles. They fired warning shots directly over the heads of the crowd. The women didn't run. The screams of the militia met a wall of defiance. These women knew the stakes. This wasn't a policy debate. It was a battle for the right to exist in public space. They stood their ground as the bullets whistled above. One day turned into two. Two turned into a week. This resistance lasted for 6 straight days. From March 8th to March 14th, the streets belonged to the protesters. It was the first major defiance of the new Islamic Republic. 6 days. The authorities were stunned by the scale of the defiance. They needed time. Khomeini's deputies announced a temporary suspension of the mandatory hijab. To the women on the streets, it felt like a victory. They thought the state had listened, but it was a trap. The regime used the boiled frog tactic. They took one step back to prepare for a leap forward. While the crowds dispersed, the hardliners were in the back rooms. They weren't reconsidering the law. They were reorganizing the apparatus of terror. How did they wait? They watched the protests fade. They waited for the international cameras to turn away. By the middle of 1980, the mask of tolerance dropped completely. The state stopped debating. The Revolutionary Guard moved into the offices and the squares. They replaced persuasion with iron. In the summer of 1980, the regime officially reinstated the decree and began mass arrests. While officials spoke of temporary concessions, the streets of 1980 told a different story. The committees of the Islamic Revolution took over. These were not just guards. They were the police, the judge, and the executioner. Imagine a couple in a darkened cinema. They are sitting close. Perhaps their hands touch. Suddenly, the door bursts open. Flashlights cut through the gloom. Rough hands drag them into the aisle. A guard checks their documents with a sneer. Then, a sharp crack. A palm hits the young man's face. No trial, no appeal. Just the sting of a slap and the smell of cheap tobacco. The committees patrolled every park and every alley. They listened for music. They sniffed for the scent of alcohol. A man and a woman walking together became a crime. Even holding hands was enough for an arrest. The regime needed more than just obedience. It needed broken spirits. By late 1979, the state moved to the final stage of humiliation. In public squares and city parks, the sound of leather hitting skin became a regular rhythm. They dragged the accused to the center of the crowd. A wooden post stood in the dirt. They tied the victim's hands high above their head. The whip lashed out. 1, 2, 10, 20. The crowd watched in a heavy, suffocating silence. A human being lashed to a pole, bleeding for the crime of being young. On February 1, 1979, a Boeing 747 touched down in Tehran. Ruhollah Khomeini stepped onto the tarmac after 14 years in exile. The crowds roared for a liberator. They got a liquidator of rights. How fast can you dismantle justice? In just a few months, the legal foundation for millions of women simply vanished. Khomeini targeted the family protection laws first. He didn't just tweak the rules, he broke them. The shock came in a single number. The minimum marriage age for girls plummeted from 18 to 9. 9 years old. That is a third-grade classroom. One day a child is a student, the next she is legally a bride. The purge moved to the courts. Khomeini signed the orders. Female judges lost their benches. High political offices slammed their doors shut. The new system stripped women of their status as equals in public life. One by one, they lost their professional ranks. Mothers whispered a final instruction before their daughters stepped outside. Adjust the headscarf. Keep your eyes on the ground. Don't speak. By the end of 1979, these warnings were the only form of protection left. The law that permitted the marriage of 9-year-old girls was no longer a radical idea. It was becoming a constitutional norm. The state formally codified the end of childhood. Sharia didn't just change the courts, it changed the air in the room. People stopped playing music, they turned down the volume of their lives. A private party became a gamble with a prison cell. Someone was always listening through the thin walls of the apartment blocks. Fear had a physical sound. The crack of a whip in a public square, the leather hitting skin in front of a silent, forced crowd. Revolutionary courts worked fast. They handed down thousands of sentences. Political rivals went to the gallows, but women went to the whipping posts. Any behavior labeled immoral meant lashes or jail. Vigilantes stood on every corner, watching for a stray lock of hair. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Families stayed behind locked doors, speaking only in hushed tones. They scrubbed every trace of their former lives from the living room. Fear needed a machine, a conveyor belt of sentences to keep the streets quiet. The regime built it overnight. Revolutionary courts and Islamic committees appeared in every city. They didn't need evidence. They didn't need lawyers. Justice was a 15-minute conversation ending in a scream. These groups operated with total power and zero oversight. Their target was simple: anyone breaking the new Islamic codes. Women stood at the front of the line. A few months ago, life was normal. Now, the past was a crime. Did you attend a mixed gathering? Did you walk with a man who isn't your husband? Maybe a strand of hair escaped your scarf. In these courts, that was enough. In 1979, these tribunals were called temporary. They promised to vanish once order returned. But the temporary became the foundation. The machine only grew hungrier. The list of capital crimes expanded to include warring against God and corruption on earth.
Khomeini wore the mask of a restrained moral guide. He publicly criticized excessive punishments to maintain the image of a steady hand. It was a calculated performance of mercy while the gallows stayed busy. How did he manage this double game? In 1980, a stoning case in Kerman province sparked an outcry. Khomeini stepped in. He reportedly instructed judges to halt such sentences. He ordered a formal ban on stoning in the courts. This single intervention became a powerful PR tool. It looked like restraint. In reality, it was a tactical pause. The streets told a different story. Floggings and arrests for moral offenses never stopped. The regime didn't blink. While Khomeini played the just ruler, the prisons reached capacity. The chaos of the revolution wasn't fading, it was being codified. By 1981, the Islamic Republic locked these moral ideas into a new constitution. Sharia became the supreme law of the land. Religion was no longer a suggestion for the faithful. It was a mandatory script for every citizen. The state wrote specific gender roles directly into the penal code. In August 1986, in the small village of Kupeya, the locals dug a hole. It was measured specifically to the height of a 35-year-old woman. Soraya Manucheri stood at the center of the crowd. Her husband wanted a new life with a teenage girl. Soraya was the obstacle. A local court provided the solution. Under a canopy of intimidation, they handed down a sentence of adultery. In remote corners like Kupeya, far from the eyes of the capital, oversight did not exist. Only the stones existed. The villagers gathered on August 15th. They led Soraya to the pit. They buried her in the earth up to her waist, pinning her arms to her sides. The first stone flew, then the second. A dull thud followed by the sound of breaking bone. The crowd closed in. This was not a quick death. It was a calculated, rhythmic demolition of a human being. Men who had been her neighbors picked up jagged rocks. They threw them until the earth around the pit turned crimson. Soraya Manucheri died slowly under the weight of the village. When the crowd finally dispersed, only a mound of bloodied stones remained in the dust of Kupeya. Soraya Manucheri was an extreme case, but the foundation for her death was laid 6 years earlier in the offices of Tehran. It started with a memo. In July 1980, the new government issued a direct order to every state employee. What is the price of a strand of hair? For thousands of women, it was their entire career. Guards stood at the gates of every ministry. They didn't hand out fines. They didn't give warnings. They simply blocked the way. Women reached the entrance and stopped. They looked at the uniforms. Then they turned around and walked away with their heads bowed. If you didn't cover your hair, you didn't have a job. No job meant no bread. By 1981, the walls of the offices could no longer contain the new morality. The hijab became mandatory in every public square, every bus, and every park. Imagine the streets. Checkpoints appeared overnight.
Officers stood on corners to inspect the length of a coat or the tightness of a scarf.
Compliance was the only way to move through your own city. In 1983, the state stopped relying on social pressure. They turned to the leather strap. The new Islamic Penal Code turned a dress code into a criminal offense. A court could now sentence a woman to 74 lashes for showing her hair. The laws of 1983 weren't just ink on paper. They were boots on the pavement. By the mid-80s, the Guidance Patrol turned the sidewalk into a minefield. They didn't work alone. Members of the Islamic Revolutionary Committees joined the hunt. Some wore green uniforms. Others blended into the crowd in plain clothes. You never knew who was watching. Fear became the primary shadow of every woman in Tehran. The mechanics of a patrol were simple and brutal. They staked out marketplaces. They waited at busy intersections. A patrol van would pull up to the curb. Officers stepped out. They scanned the crowd for bad hijab, a loose strand of hair, a coat an inch too short, a flash of color. The confrontation was instant. No discussion, no defense. Imagine standing at a red light. You don't move. You don't look up. Any sudden gesture could be a signal. Then, the sound of boots stops behind you. Officers used a specific tool for those who resisted or tried to run. The catch pole. A long, cold metal rod with a spring-loaded loop at the end. The officer hooks the loop. He jerks the pole. The steel teeth snap shut around the woman's neck. One twist and she is pinned, gasping, metal pressing against her windpipe. Human rights reports from this era are a litany of broken teeth and bruised throats. Women were slapped, stripped of their scarves, or dragged by their hair into the dark interior of a van. On every street corner, the message was the same. Every woman lowered her eyes. Those caught in the metal loops of the catch poles didn't go to police stations. They went to revolutionary courts. No lawyers waited there. No defense existed. The system moved with mechanical speed. Ayatollah Khomeini personally appointed the judges, bypassing every secular law on the books. These men answered only to him. Most trials lasted minutes. An accusation was a conviction. Did anyone investigate the charges? Never. The Islamic committees relied on one tool, the confession. They extracted these admissions in basement cells using systematic torture. Once a suspect spoke, the file was closed. The machinery of the state ignored evidence. It focused on cleansing. Judges issued sentences within days, sometimes hours, of an arrest. They didn't hide the brutality, they celebrated it. Khomeini's ideology served as the ultimate legal code. Public squares became the new courtrooms. Families watched as neighbors collapsed under the whip. These were not executions of high-ranking officials. They were the public floggings of ordinary people. The regime justified every strike as a divine necessity to purge society. Sentences from these lightning-fast courts didn't end in cellars. The regime took the punishment to the market squares. The crack of the whip cut through the noise of the bazaar. It was a dry, snapping sound. Shopkeepers lowered their metal shutters in silence. For a few minutes, the heart of the city stopped. One strike, then another. This sound became the new rhythm of Iranian life. Who felt the weight of the new order first? The answer lay in the schools. The transformation reached deep into the classrooms. It started at the primary level. Small children found themselves divided. One entrance for boys, another for girls. The state separated them before they could even understand why. Universities followed. On engineering faculties, the air grew heavy with surveillance. Professors watched for a loose strand of hair or a flash of color. One mistake could end a career. The regime didn't just want obedience. It wanted a total redesign of the social fabric. The state moved from the mind to the body. It claimed the outdoors. They put up fences on the sand and chains on the gates. Officials segregated public beaches and closed parks to mixed groups. The state didn't just stop at fences and segregated sand. While the beaches were being divided, the courts expanded the list of sins to include capital offenses. One uncovered lock of hair was enough. A judge could sentence a woman to 74 lashes for an improper veil. Who was punished the most? Statistics from the early 1980s provide a clear answer.
The regime revived ancient, brutal penalties for any sexual behavior outside their control. Adultery, fornication, anything the law labeled moral corruption. These weren't just crimes, they were corruption on earth. This specific legal term allowed the state to send anyone to the gallows for almost any action. The numbers became a conveyor belt of pain. Thousands of men and women faced the whip in the early 1980s. Some sentences reached hundreds of lashes. For others, the punishment was terminal. Human rights groups later documented the reality: imprisonment, public floggings, and executions by stoning.
Women remained the primary targets of every new decree. Even if a woman avoided the public squares and the courts, danger waited for her behind the door of her own bedroom. The state didn't stop at the threshold. It moved into the hallway. It sat at the dinner table. The mechanism of control was simple: total prohibition. Alcohol meant a public whipping and heavy fines. Theft resulted in the surgical removal of fingers or hands. Even a mixed-gender party became a crime scene. The morality police patrolled the streets, but the walls of private apartments offered no protection. Imagine the scene. A teenage girl stands in a living room with a male friend. Music is playing. Suddenly, the front door splinters under a boot. The Revolutionary Guard swarms the room. They drag the girl out by her hair. Her crime? Waging war against God. This specific charge, Moharebe, was the ultimate weapon. It allowed the state to execute teenagers for ordinary social behavior. Why? Because the regime viewed a private conversation as a direct attack on the creator. The pressure changed the DNA of the Iranian family. Mothers began to cry in private, muffled by pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Parents looked at their daughters and saw targets. They stopped opening the door. Fear dictated the morning routine. Fathers kept their daughters home from school. They locked the gates. They watched the street through closed blinds. By the mid-80s, the home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage built from the silence of terrified parents. The walls of Iranian homes had absorbed the fear. By 1989, the terror of the streets had seeped into the bedroom and the kitchen. Even the death of the system's architect in June 1989 changed nothing. Ayatollah Khomeini was old. He was dying. The revolution that once promised liberation had curdled into a decade of surveillance and grief. The Iran-Iraq war had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Families were thin. Political purges and executions had finished what the front line started. How did the youth see this world? An entire generation had been born during the chaos. By the time Khomeini took his last breath, these children were entering adulthood. They knew no other reality. They had never seen a woman's hair in public. They had never heard music on the street without a permit. The population of Iran doubled in the years following the revolution. This created a massive, lost generation trapped in a permanent state of emergency. For them, the morality police were not a new intrusion. They were as natural as the weather. In June, millions flooded the funeral in a fever of public mourning. They tore at the shroud. They wailed for the cameras. But behind closed doors, the silence was different. People looked at their daughters and wondered if the nightmare would end with the man who wrote it. It didn't. The laws remained. The patrols stayed on the corners. The system outlived its creator, enforced by a bureaucracy that didn't need a heart to function. The new leadership maintained every restriction without skipping a single day. Khomeini died in June. By July, the patrols were still dragging women into vans. The creator was gone, but the machine stayed in motion. The emergency measures of the 80s didn't vanish. They became the new architecture of Iranian life. The street remained a minefield. Morality squads used catch poles to snare women like stray animals. One wrong move meant a slap to the face or a heavy wooden baton. Thousands of Iranian women faced arrest in the years following 1989. Human rights reports documented the same cycle: the van, the cell, the lashes. Public punishment was no longer a revolution. It was a career for the guards and a routine for the victims. Before stepping outside, a woman stopped at the mirror. She didn't check her beauty, she checked her safety. She adjusted her hijab with a practiced mechanical reflex.
The state lived inside the family home now. Parents taught their daughters the art of silence.
Husbands became enforcers not out of malice, but out of terror for the entire household. One loose strand of hair could bring the police to their door. Every morning, men scanned their wives' outfits to calculate the risk of a prison sentence. Fear dictated the map of the city. Women memorized which alleys the vans avoided and which corners belonged to the squads. They chose the long way to work. They took the stairs instead of the elevator. They picked the safest route. The vans changed their routes, but the shadow cast in the 1980s stayed with these women forever. It wasn't just about the law, it was about the cells of the brain. The state didn't just patrol the streets, it patrolled the psyche. Psychologists now identify this as a collective post-traumatic stress disorder. An entire generation of Iranian women lives with a nervous system wired for a threat that never truly left. Trust within families dissolved. Neighbors watched neighbors. Public shaming became a social acid, eating through the fabric of communities until only suspicion remained. Even today, the reflex remains. A woman adjusts her headscarf before a security camera. Her heart rate spikes when a white van slows down. International pressure sometimes halted a public whipping. Later leaders softened the edges of the harshest decrees. But the foundation held firm. The legal system had already achieved its primary goal. It transformed the female body into a political battlefield and a symbol of state obedience. Khomeini died in June 1989. The culture of fear he built did not. The shadow still follows them, step by step, through every street.